Is that your Seasteading shirt there?
Yes.
I like that. Very good. Well, thanks for joining me. It's been it's been great to see your project blossom over the years. I've heard about it for years, and to see it taking that these leaps that it's taking in the last few years, at least just in the media coverage and everything, has been remarkable.
It's been extraordinary how the global media, at least in the English-speaking world, just spontaneously flipped. I came on with the Seasteading Institute, to try to explain it to normal people, and there was a lot of negativity associated with it. So getting on the mainstream media would consist of just getting punched in the face verbally over and over. I remember being on KQED, and every single caller that came in to talk to me and Patri Friedman was very negative, very hostile. That was the morning before I got on a plane and flew to French Polynesia. And then once we actually started to have a project, and Polynesians started to get involved, and it started to be about allowing them to organically adapt to their own sea level problems. And it became about, hey, we're going to do our own thing with our own society, no threat to you. It was like all of a sudden, all the press spontaneously all became positive.
They got it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like all of a sudden it became about something else. And so former, Wired and certain places wrote hit pieces, without even talking to us, reporting things that weren't true. And then all of a sudden those PR articles turned around and wrote very positive things, even the New York Times, which I was a little worried about. So it's funny to go from the pariah in the media to the popular kid bringing solutions to the world. So it's very, very gratifying.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to see that. That's remarkable. I feel like I'm talking on Skype with maybe 200 years from now, you're going to be like a Thomas Jefferson figure, huh? I know, whatever, it's apples and oranges, what you're doing versus what they were doing, but there's some similarity in the sense that you're paving a path for a new way of having a society.
I actually think it's, apples a few hundred years ago and apples now. I do think there is something very similar going on there, because I actually feature this in the Seasteading book. I think of North America as a giant seastead. So people from Europe who were dissatisfied, many of them religious people with odd beliefs, came somewhere else to build their own societies. And no matter what you think of how that played out, it was largely different groups saying, screw this, I'm going to go somewhere else and found my own community. And then there were all these little territories expanding across North America, each of which was competing to attract people to their particular territory, each of which offered governance innovations, and then eventually gave rise to this sort of representative democracy that monarchists in the old world wouldn't have thought was possible. They also wouldn't have believed not only could, landless people vote, but women could vote, and then people that weren't even white could vote. It seemed all very strange, but it all worked out very well. That ended up creating a free society that was very prosperous, very proved things that people didn't think were true, and then became a powerful force against the rise of dictatorships in the old world, and stood up against it and basically saved the world. So I do think that that's the reason it's called seasteading, is because it's like homesteading, but you're doing it on the sea, and this will be a technology that accelerates that process of people founding new societies and trying new things and innovating in 21st century ways of living together. And as long as people can choose among them voluntarily, it'll unleash a market of governance that in principle will discover better ways of living together.
And that's very interesting. So in some sense, you are being the most patriotic in terms of honoring the legacy of the founders by continuing what the vision they had and just moving it down the field that much farther in the spirit of what they had, right? Which was like that Declaration of Independence, the right for people to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes, and I think seasteading, mobile societies that are disassemblable that you can choose among, is such a deep solution that patriots should say, oh, this is a way to rediscover the original values I believed in. And the people that don't like their country can say, hey, this is a way that I can do something better. I really think it gets deeper and beyond all these divisions. If you have a better idea, go try it out. So it's sort of like, I always compare it to Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard discovered, amazing things with regard to computers. But there were Steve Wozniaks out there that had other ideas. And he proposed the personal computer, his design for it, 5 times, and Hewlett-Packard thought it was impossible. It was unreasonable. They couldn't think through all the implications. It was rejected 5 times. And despite his loyalty to Hewlett-Packard, Steve Wozniak ended up breaking away and trying something somewhere else with his buddy Steve Jobs, and that became Apple, and those designs became the personal computer that we know today. So the question is, where will the Wozniaks of governance go? We don't need to argue about, are you loyal to IBM or are you loyal to Hewlett-Packard? The guys who founded IBM and the guys who founded the United States of America were the great innovators of their day. But Thomas Jefferson, who I've read a ton of his stuff, including his private letters, he was conceiving of something when information traveled at the speed of a horse, when people wrote with quill pens, when they lived in an agrarian society. It's an innovation from previous centuries that's the best we have so far. And I always compare it to Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin innovated in controlling electricity, and he innovated in governance. And because people were allowed to experiment with different ways of using electricity, we're living in this fabulous world right now, completely permeated with electricity that allows you and I to talk across time and space. But his experiments with governance have not advanced. They're still stuck in that previous century. And it's largely because new innovators have no place to go to innovate in a new way and try something new. And if there hadn't been a new world, we wouldn't know who Ben Franklin was. So I think of seasteading as continuing this tradition of applying new innovations, new values to new worlds. It's the new blue world.
I like that. And there was a favorite book of mine in the business section of the bookstore I used to like called The Blue Ocean Strategy.
Interesting. I don't know if I have. I should have.
It's called Blue Ocean Strategy, and it's actually very similar to Peter Thiel's later book, 0 to 1. But Blue Ocean Strategy was all about don't compete in red ocean, which is water that's heavily bloodied by excessive competition.
Yes.
Go out and find uncharted territory and create your own, monopoly, your own blue ocean where you don't have any competition to fight over endlessly.
Right. And so in honor of your show today, I wore this shirt, which is a phrase I came up with, stop arguing, start seasteading, which is a way of getting at people's core experience on social media, that we have to argue with our opponents and there's only 2 choices, and whoever controls a government that controls hundreds of millions of people gets to enforce their views on other people. That's not the best way to discover better solutions. All the energy we put into that, we should put into creating new societies, and with seasteading, the technology is at hand.
And by the way, the idea that America is a seastead already kind of resonates with me here in Florida. You can often find yourself walking in heavily irrigated areas in Florida where, you can actually fall into a sinkhole, and end up in the ocean right here. And
right.
So, we're not too far away from being a place that is uninhabitable too, but for the grace of air conditioning, made this place possible. I mean, this show is brought to you by air conditioning, because if it wasn't for that, a big Viking-looking guy like me wouldn't be able to stomach the heat right now in February in Florida. It'd be too hot, I wouldn't be able to even have a conversation without getting out my fan.
Yeah.
And but that's thanks to the innovation that happens when people can see something ahead of the curve, while everybody else thinks you're crazy. So I like the perspective you have. So your main pitch is a positive one. You're not doing you're not doing the doomsday, let's get out of here like Noah's Ark. That's not your primary pitch. It's a positive, optimistic approach, right? Not a get on the Noah's Ark before everything falls into a, catastrophe.
Again, it's a deep enough solution that I do think it's also part of what drives it is optimism, but also part of what drives it, if I just speak on my part, is I think humanity is not going to survive the rise of 193 surveillance societies known as nation states. We have to innovate in this system. I have a friend who calls me Joah, after Noah, because it's like I'm building an ark. And if you think startups are the source of solution and you want to bring a Silicon Valley sensibility to governance, then you want to experiment in new ways of doing things and see what you discover. But I do think we're in a very dire situation with regard to debt, with regard to currency. There's just too much innovation arising from decentralization, and we can't. The exponential increase in technologies, I don't think, is going to survive a stuck in previous centuries monopolies of violence that are nation states. So I do think of myself as doing my best to provide people with their arcs.
So Thomas Jefferson and Noah, I like this.
Yes, well,
my heroes.
Yes, well, we should study the ancients the old wisdom is there among many of the greats, and we can. I actually have lists of quotes on my computer that appear in front of me to steel myself and remind myself of what we're trying to apply to a new world. So yes, I think these old stories resonate with people across time because they represent the old verities of what it means to struggle to be a fulfilled human.
Right, and those are what Nassim Taleb would say, those are anti-fragile because they've stood the test of thousands of years, whereas unfortunately the monopoly state, or the public monopoly state, is a very new thing. And it's had some very good wins, but it's also had some very serious design flaws, as we've seen every day.
Yeah, and the monopoly nation states are fragile. They're brittle. They're incredibly powerful, but they're not anti-fragile. I mean, all sorts of terrible things can happen, and they have in the 20th century, and we don't want to repeat the 20th century in the 21st.
So let me ask you a question then. Just thinking off the top of the head here, there's that popular thing here in the political background to talk about male fragility. So we got to talk about state fragility. What is to stop states from being too insecure about the rise of seasteads? Do you see that fragility, so to speak, leaking out into being aggressive towards seasteads?
So the good thing about giant empire governments is they're big dumb dinosaurs that react slowly, and they're difficult to threaten. So when I think about, so people ask this question a lot, like, suppose you prosper on a seastead, what's to stop China or the United States just going out there and taking it from you? And the only way to answer that question is to look at precedents. And my favorite precedent is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong you can think of as a priestead. There was the gigantic, powerful Red China, with many of its citizens starving, with a lot of power. And through historical accident and negotiations with the West, Hong Kong was sort of a little nubbin, a little flea on the butt of China. And it was largely a free market. It was sort of a Asian culture with kind of UK rules administered by Mr. Copperweight, who believed in a hands-off, laissez-faire policy. And Hong Kong, in a very short period of time, created so much prosperity that China didn't invade it because there was nothing to steal. So when countries invade other countries, they're trying to control the resources inside it. Iraq would be an example. But if it's nothing but freedom and interaction and trade, what is it you're going to take? So China, the great country of China, observed what was happening in Hong Kong, and when Deng Xiaoping took over, they became interested in learning from Hong Kong and experimenting with special economic zones, which were a way of imitating Hong Kong. So they opened Shenzhen, they opened various little special economic zones within China, and economic freedom created so much prosperity in those places. It ended up being hundreds of them spread across China. China kind of opened its doors and allowed trade with the world. And there was just a drastic growth that suddenly happened in China because of the example of Hong Kong. And at least 500 million people have escaped extreme poverty as they fled to these special economic zones. Tom W. Bell, who wrote From Nation States to Stateless Nations, that's the subtitle. The main title is called Your Next Government ? He designed the C zone, and he based it on the 4,000 special economic zones that have spread across the world in various countries because largely of the example of Hong Kong. That's just one example. And if you look around the world, Malaysia doesn't attack Singapore. The United States doesn't attack the Cayman Islands, and Cayman Islands has no standing army, no way to defend itself, because there's basically nothing to take. And I think people little appreciate the power of better examples to change policies in the old great nation states. So seasteads have an incentive to peacefully create better societies that work better and set better examples, the same way Estonia has set better examples that are changing policies in many European countries. And we can go on and on with these examples, but generally the big countries don't invade Iceland or Malta or any of these island states, most of which don't have armies to defend themselves.
So, but what about if there was like a huge concentration of very successful billionaires there, and they say we want to get a piece of that, we want to tax that nice fresh farm of wealthy billionaires that can help subsidize our failing welfare states back at home. I mean, is there any way we can get something like I keep imagining the perfect sci-fi weapon would be like in Star Wars Episode 1 where they have that bubble defense, and they shoot lasers and you can't even affect it. It's just perfectly safe on that. I mean, that's silly, but I mean it kind of gives you an example of something that I wish we could have.
Well, who knows what could emerge with technologies in the near future, and who knows what could emerge with regard to cryptocurrencies where, the nation states can't keep track of who's paying what or where money's coming from. But again, I use the example of the Cayman Islands. I think it's 60,000 people. It's not very many people. And they have no way of defending themselves, and they welcome financial mavericks, and they welcome medical innovators, and people build hospitals and all sorts of successful businesses in the Cayman Islands, and the U.S. doesn't attack it and they. A really great story. Barack Obama, I kind of feature this story briefly in my book. He actually publicly criticized in a speech the Cayman Islands for being a tax haven. And the very next day, without hesitation, Cayman Islands put out an official letter reminding the United States of their service to various financial institutions in the U.S. And the Obama administration never brought it up again. It went back to silence, and the Cayman Islands returned to business. So the analogy I use is if you want to be a seastead, you want to think like a cleaner fish in a world of sharks. You want to provide a service that's valuable enough to the sharks that they don't just want to eat you. They can get more out of you operating within their teeth than they can just swallowing you.
That makes sense. So it's a symbiotic relationship that we want to build.
Right.
It's like if you we will be able. So the argument needs to be made to states that the people who are going to live here are going to produce more things that will generate wealth for the respective countries they've come from if they live there, if they live in the new seastead rather than live back home. That's kind of like the sales pitch, right? In a nutshell.
Yeah.
We'll be more, you leave us alone, we'll give you stuff that'll make you very happy, without, a lot better than if I have to stay there.
Yes, I mean, seasteads will be provocative, but you want to act like the Cayman Islands and not like Grenada in the 80s. You don't want to start selling drugs to, or whatever it is you're going to do. You want to be just innovative enough that it's a little provocative and maybe other countries could learn from you, but you don't want to directly assault the basic values of the powerful countries.
Right. I think a popular conception of seasteading, unfortunately, in the past probably has been that if it's a bunch of libertarians and stuff, they're going to be, it's going to be like one giant party boat 24/7 with, and I know that's not just libertarians, but that's the stigma that people had, is that, if there's no rules, then how are you going to have decency? But I think you would have rules, right? There would be like a private covenant agreement that you sign, just like you are in a HOA or something, right?
Yes, that's a good example. Tom W. Bell uses that example a lot, and it always helps people understand if you use concrete examples. And the example I always use is the cruise ship. The cruise ship is largely self-governing. A lot of them are flagged in Liberia or Panama, which have no ability to enforce rules or protect you for the most part, especially Liberia. So they have to fly the flag of a place, but they're kind of de facto self-governing, and you sign a contract when you get on board the ship, or you sign a contract when you take employment on the ship. You're going to have private health care, you're going to have private security. They guarantee the food will be safe. They guarantee that the ships are going to be safe. So it's not that terrifying. It's like when you go out and found your own society, you're not saying there's going to be no rules. You're saying we're going to have a startup rule provision society that takes the best practices of other places and instantiates them on one place. That's basically what the C zone we've proposed is. And then other people can start their own societies. The best ways of governing ourselves have not been discovered yet, and I think seasteading is a chance to do that.
So, do you have a private constitution that's do you already have it devised and published, or have you not got to that point yet?
We have a few constitutions that have been proposed to us. And matter of fact, one was featured on a blog. And it sparked some discussion among experts. And it's a constitution for the ultimate free society. You can check it out at seasteading.org. Just look up, Constitution for a Seastead ? And then there's a paper. There's some analysis, and there's a discussion on our forums. But ultimately, I actually think a constitution is what you need when you have a giant landmass and you're going to have a monopoly over a group of people and you're trying to set the rules, and then it just ends up being a piece of paper that people are free to defy if they have power. I think seasteading is interesting because it's a technology for people to leave and choose another society. It's a technology for people to create their own society. So it's like a business for people to provide different forms of rules and values that other people can choose. And if people don't choose it, then you go out of business. So when I board a cruise ship, I'm not really signing, there's not a constitution signed by people before I was born. There's a private contract that I sign that's trying to convince me to get on that cruise line. And if it's not good enough for me and I'm unhappy, I can switch to another cruise line. And my ability to choose and switch is what drives the innovations of the various cruise lines. And I point out to people that a cruise ship captain is de facto a dictator. If he actually started flogging you and keel hauling you, maybe the Panama would have to take action. But he has a lot of power. Like if you get drunk and molest women and start a fight, he can lock you in the brig and not let you out. He can also abandon you on an island in the middle of nowhere and wave bye-bye and not return your money. He can get his security guards to do a lot. And the question is, why doesn't he become a tyrant? Why do we not even know who he is? And he kind of sits back and runs his ship in such a way that all we do is enjoy ourselves. Well, it's because his company will go broke if he doesn't provide superior governance that competes with all the other cruise lines that you could switch to. We want governance providers that are in fear of your Yahoo review. And I think that's what seasteads will provide, and we just can't get that with the old legacy governments we have now.
So some seasteads would be maybe owned by a sole proprietorship. Others might be owned by an association, HOA type arrangement. Others would have a council. Um, what happens if you get, I mean, this is just, thinking out loud. What happens if you get like a culty environment setting up, where it's like a cult of personality, a Jim Jones kind of thing, I mean,
Yeah.
you just leave them alone, right? You cut the tether of their island off.
Right. Right. I mean, I think many nation states in our world today are that situation, death cult situations. But yes, suppose a crazy cult leader like Jim Jones himself wants to go out and found his own seastead. He's free to do that, and people are free to choose it. However, Jim Jones has to think of a business model to pay for the tremendous expense of a floating island. He has to offer something that people can't get other places. It's one thing to move to a jungle and just set up something in the middle of nowhere and convince people to move there because they are seduced by your preaching. What I love about seasteads is it's kind of like, what's to stop a cruise ship from being a cult situation? Well, L. Ron Hubbard kind of did set that up. But, it's no threat to me if people who have strange beliefs that I disagree with can go do their own thing. It is a threat to me if those people can get in charge of my government. So I think the more we proliferate choices and allow the diversity and eccentricities of people to choose, the more interesting things will emerge. And since people can go bankrupt if they don't provide the best possible governance rules, I'm less worried about Jim Jones forming a seastead than I am to him rising to the top of a corrupt nation state and then begins executing and starving people inside his country. The worst things we can imagine with regard to governance are already happening among nation states now and have happened in the recent past.
Yeah, I agree. So your first project is near French Polynesia, is that correct?
French Polynesia have signed a memorandum of understanding with the Seasteading Institute, which allowed the founding of a for-profit company called Blue Frontiers, which is researching the possibility of building a sustainable floating island in a protected lagoon in French Polynesia. And we've contracted out the economic impact analysis. We've run the environmental impact analysis, and we've proposed the legislation that we hope French Polynesia will pass. So there's the ultimate goal of seasteading is to go to the high seas, but we're going to do this incrementally because it's very expensive to go to the high seas. French Polynesia controls an area of ocean the size of Western Europe. So you can think of this as the new blue continent, where you can experiment with different sorts of societies if you want. But our plan is to start very small. And the great thing about floating islands is they're an entrepreneurial solution to two of the biggest problems in the world. We've already talked about the lack of innovation and governance, but the immediate imperative of many of these island nations is to deal with sea level change. And they had nothing to do with causing this, but they certainly want to do something about it. And the floating pavilion in Rotterdam is sort of the prototype. It's built by our engineers. It's a floating, sustainable, solar-powered pavilion. And they're going to bring that technology, if we're permitted, to Tahiti, and we'll build a floating island for about 250 people or about. And if it's successful, we will set the first example of a free, prosperous society, and then we'll take incremental steps to take things a little further. But it's also about providing immediate solutions to island nations some of which are losing their islands. Kiribati being one of the most terrible examples of a country due to sink below the oceans, basically, before the end of this century.
What about when is the estimated time of completion for this, that it would be open for business?
Well, if French Polynesia approves our legislation for the sea zone, we could start building very fast and have it ready, in the 2020s. It depends on whether they approve it or not, or whether they ask for amendments or whatever is going to happen. It's still up in the air whether it's going to be approved, but we're also looking at other coastal and island nations. We go to places that already have special economic zones on the books, which I described before, and we say, well, we're taking the next step in legal innovation, which is the C zone, and we don't even need your land. We'll bring our own land, and we absorb the costs of failure. But if the island succeeds, then we share in the prosperity. So it's the ultimate voluntarist deal offered in the territorial waters of existing nation states. We would love to start in French Polynesia because it's such a great first choice to get started. But there's many places around the world we'd like to spread this technology to and start scaling up.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the country of Nauru. Have you talked to them at all? Because I was thinking about, I know that's more out in the deep blue, right? Is that close? That's out in the middle of the deeper waters. But even doing something on land with them, maybe would they be interested? Because I know they've been extremely economically depressed. The nation states came in and extracted all the mining resources, and it's like 80% massive obesity problem, and there's no work, and there's a problem there, right? And so, is there a way that you could say, hey, let's try it on land here. Let's make a voluntarist project on this existing piece of land in Nauru. Have you talked to anybody about that?
I don't think we've talked directly to them. We would love to talk to them, but we've talked to a bunch of island nations. And they all have pluses and minuses. And one of the challenges is always if you're far from an economic center, and if you're remote enough, it's difficult to build up your economy, or it's even sometimes difficult for people to travel out there and get goods out there. But I would like to see, the nations of the world, everyone talks about saving the planet. How about start with savings, the island, an island nation first? Nauru would be a good example. Kiribati would be a good example. The Maldives would be good. Tonga. There's a lot of these places that are their own countries that control a large area of ocean that we could get started in. It's a matter of not making it too expensive to get started. And I think once we scale up a bunch of these, we can definitely start moving to those places. I think it's all about setting the first prosperous example.
Yeah, very good. It's all about imitation. When you set, one of the things that I talk about in my writing a lot is the power of imitation. Imitation being a driving component of so much of human desire. And, you can get caught up in a magnetic attraction of conflict, or you can create a magnetic attraction of reciprocal, positive, non-violent solutions to all kinds of issues. And that sounds to me the key to what you're talking about is let's set a good example. Show, we're going to enact what we can do and let that model speak for itself, so that not only do other people do seasteading like us, but other countries become more like us, less violent, less aggressive, less coercive, right?
Yes. I mean, what you say is interesting with regard to imitation and mimetics. I mean, it's been shown the human brain can't even develop properly unless it's interacting with all the other brains around it. You literally can't, once you get to 6 and you haven't been exposed to language, you're never able to use syntax. And that just keeps going and going. And the very words we're using, I'm kind of imitating from other people. But at some point, as an adult, you have to think independently and take something and think creatively and take it one step further about how we can innovate. Innovation is always kind of incremental, and it involves learning from other people. And part of the way the brain works is it's difficult. Seasteading has always been stuck in abstractions, explaining how things could work. Yeah. But as I'm also a writer, and if you want to teach people things, you have to give them concrete examples. That's the way our minds work. Like I see it, I see how it works. Now I'm not hostile to it.
Yeah, that's why Jesus said, "Eat my body, drink my blood."
Internalize.
It's tangible. Become me. Be me.
Right. rather than here's a set of virtues, think about them and become that.
Right.
My first love is fiction. So you take these old imperatives and you try to put them in characters and make people feel it. That's what converts you more than thinking through things. So
Absolutely. It's all about the story. And that's what sounds like you're trying to do, is tell a good narrative. What's fascinating about this, it almost gives me chills to think about. What we're talking about is founding a new society. And what we're talking about with that is to have an anti-myth as the myth. Because every society in ancient times was founded with mythic creation stories.
right.
So we're in the process of thinking out loud as we have conversations like this about what will be the founding myth, or perhaps the founding anti-myth of the next concept of society, the next embodiment of society, perhaps. Let's put it that way.
And seasteading, as it's been adopted by people around the world, I've kind of realized is more meta-mythologically powerful than I ever imagined, because we're Polynesians are getting involved. Not all Polynesians, but some, and it resonates with their myth of the master navigators moving from island to island, using nothing but their senses, and not liking one island, so you switch to another island and go found your own. And this they kind of moved east on the blue frontier. That's kind of part of their tradition. And they even have the Polynesians have an ancient story, especially the Hawaiians, about a floating island, a place that's more prosperous that you could go to. It's called Mokulana. And even when so a new society has to be is new in every way. So every type of innovator comes to seasteading with a different perspective of what they can do. Like engineers think, okay, this is an engineering problem. If we could solve that, then the problem is solved. Other people think this is a values problem. If we could start over with new values, the problem is solved. Lawyers think it's about law. It's about, we set up what the original rules are, we write a constitution, and it's kind of like it's an elephant. And everybody's saying, oh my God, seasteading would be the perfect tusk. It would be the perfect tail. And at first I thought it was an abstraction, and I was worried about how I'm going to tell the story. And it wasn't until I met all the people getting involved that I realized, oh, it's the whole elephant. And the only way to talk about this is to tell the stories of all these individuals and how they came to it and what they see they could do with a new society. So you say, we have a new jurisdiction. What could you do with it? Every innovator in the world is coming to you with their own ideas. So we're already engaging like the decentralized global brain. And if we get that first positive example, I think all bets are off, and everyone will want their seastead.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I think that's the key, is to set a good example, to embody nonviolence, peace, charity, mercy. People think private property is a stinginess, but it's not. You can have a mercy, very kind and gracious and beautiful private property-based structure of civilization. It's something that I emphasize all the time. And again, you're right about storytelling. That's the key thing. We are storytelling creatures. That's the fundamental, what makes us human, is our ability to share common stories of who we are and where we are in space and time. And one of the things I do with A Neighbor's Choice is I tell the stories of victims of state violence. Mm-hmm. And I think that's more powerful than making an argument. For example, if you don't like the income tax, I can talk about how it's unconstitutional. I can talk about how it hurts people and how it's this and that on technical levels. But I can also tell stories. I can tell stories of people like Irwin Schiff, who died as an old man to a prison bed, not even allowed to see his children. And I ask people, whatever, and what's powerful about stories, when I tell this story of Irwin Schiff to the most big government-loving liberal or whatever, they crack. They crack because they see it. They see in their mind's eye Irwin Schiff dying, not allowed to hug his grandchildren for the sin of tax avoidance or whatever.
And this is Peter Schiff's dad?
Yeah.
Man, my God, I didn't know he was chained to his bed. That's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, what they did is they confined him to a hospital bed where he was not allowed to be peaceful. He wasn't allowed to come out and get some fresh air. So he had to die. Basically, they chain him like prisoners in their hospital bed, and they even moved him far away from his family, so his grandkids couldn't even hug him. He was in a faraway prison system, far away from the country. And I think to myself, what has happened to our humanity when we can't look at that and say, why is an elderly man, okay, we take, how they say steel man people's arguments. So let's steel man the opponent's argument, say it's very greedy to not want to pay income tax. So he's very greedy, if you want to say that, which I don't think he was. So you're saying for the sin of being greedy, he can't get fresh air and hug his grandchildren as he's sick?
Right.
When you tell that story, it grips you. And if we told more stories of that, I think we would start to wake up and start to say, I was a bleeding heart liberal, but I can't stop looking at that grandparent's eyes. I can't stop looking at him and saying, why can't he hug his grandchild? Because he was greedy or whatever you think. That's not worth putting someone in a cage or depriving them of their ability to have a life. Life is so precious. Until they can figure out how to extend it, we don't have, only but a few decades.
Yeah.
So to deprive people of that precious opportunity on earth for greed or whatever it is at the heart of the nation state, it's just an absolute travesty. So I see the inversion here because I focus on, unfortunately, a lot of the negative because I'm trying to tell these stories, but thinking about how you can tell stories of the positive, of individual lives doing nonviolent, peaceful things.
Yes.
The founding of your society is very beautiful to see that.
Yes, and the emotional effect you wanted to achieve just occurred in me because we were having a discussion about ideas and we're sort of excited about them. All of a sudden you start telling a story about an individual and I'm emotionally moved, and now that conversion is possible because it's not just my mind is being stimulated, my heart is opening to wow, that really is unfair, and it makes me think about, if I want to provide health care for the poor children, that I'm doing it through this most dangerous superstition, as it was called by the other tax avoider. I'm forgetting his name right now. Yes, I mean, I've read Irwin Schiff's arguments. I mean, he's articulate. He makes a moral case. Smart guy. I didn't know that he ended that way. And this thing about stories, people underestimate how powerful it is. So, I spoke earlier in your episode here about how difficult it was taking on the storytelling of seasteading when there's so much negativity about it. And our instinct, when we get all this negative stuff coming at us, you're just a bunch of billionaire tax avoiders who want to say screw the world and go do your own thing because you're selfish and greedy, is to start defending yourself and arguing back. And that never converts the other person. The way to make the bad story go away is to tell a better, more compelling, positive story that ends up burying the old story. That has happened with seasteading. It's a better, bigger story that is outgrowing its negative story. And we can keep doing that. And it was also true with regard to the book. Instead of making it about me explaining why seasteading could work, I interview actual people trying to do it and talk about their struggles. And that's what makes it a readable book, not just a bunch of ideas. So we radically underestimate the power of stories to transform the world and make, it starts as a story and then it becomes a reality.
And what you're doing has some profound anthropological foundations and impact here because let's go to the big picture for a moment. And you can think about the founding of every ancient civilization. We've looked at it archaeologically, and we keep finding at the cornerstone the remains of human sacrifice.
Yes.
The remains of victims, of peasants, oftentimes children, laid in the cornerstone ceremony that would be the founding. So today when we have businesses, I tell people, we have businesses that have ribbon cutting ceremonies,
Mm-hmm.
That's how you open up a new business. Well, how they would found a new city. was to bury someone alive and kill them, to bless and sanctify with a ritual human sacrifice the founding of a new civilization. And what's beautiful about your story is if you can capture and enact your vision, thousands of years from now, they're not going to find there's no ritual sacrifices at the founding of your city. It's a brand new day for humanity, potentially, that we can move away from, because even in our more earlier, our younger countries, every country is founded through bloodshed and sacrifice, the wars and so forth. But to found a country with no bodies hidden, that is a demonstrable leap for the human species.
That is profound. I mean, yes, every civilization is founded on human sacrifice, and most of the existing nations are founded by conquerors. And the boundaries between people are where these armies came up against each other and stopped after a while. And most land is owned by people who took it from other people. And this is a chance to not found society on human sacrifice, but on actual voluntary relationships. Yes, there will be no bodies built into the foundations of seasteads. They'll just be handshakes. There'll be agreements because of the nature of the technology. And, it's funny, you had Jordan Peterson on your show, and I just heard him define an archetype as a meme that's so powerful, it permeated ancient people's minds and changed the course of evolution itself. I said, wow, I never knew what the difference between an archetype and like a stereotype is until he said that. And all civilizations are, they go through this strange evolution, which is they start with human sacrifice, then they move to animal sacrifice, then they move to symbolic sacrifice. I was an altar boy, I was raised Catholic, and there's this symbolic sacrifice of a deity. And Burning Man is a big influence on seasteading. And, what does it mean when some guy goes out on the beach and builds a giant man and burns it? And then the next year, 50 people come back and they do it again. And then the next year, 500 people come back and they do it again. Then they're told they can't do that anymore. So they move to a middle of a blank desert where no one is allowed to build anything, where there's no life. There's no reason to found a civilization there except that nobody's using it. And they build a giant man out there and burn it. And there's something so emotionally powerful about it. It keeps drawing tens of thousands of people to go out there. And when I first started getting involved, first I thought, I'm at the roots of a new religion. It seems like there's some crazy modern pagan thing emerging out here with new values, new belief systems, new trade economies on a completely blank slate. And anyone who goes repeatedly, as I did, starts to think, what if you had hundreds of these new societies? What interesting ways of getting along would we discover? And it was at Burning Man where I was introduced to Patri Friedman, grandson of Milton Friedman, who described seasteading to me. And I didn't understand why you'd want to seastead until I went home and saw that the seasteading logo was based on the Burning Man logo. And that got me interested, and it caused me to look up Patri's blog. And that's where I learned that that featureless desert where they were founding a new temporary society once a year is like a startup society where you get to start over with new rules. But the ocean, that's 45% of the Earth's surface, is unclaimed by any existing nation state. And that the technology to found these new societies is rapidly approaching if you could combine the cruise ship with the oil platform. And these would be new nano nations where people could try new things. And so I see this as this kind of stepwise evolution we have out of our primitive beliefs. It's very powerful that all these separate civilizations were founded on similar beliefs, including ritual human sacrifice, people that are separate from each other on different continents. And I think we could unleash the new voluntary society on planet ocean. 2/3 of the Earth is planet ocean, and nearly half of it is completely a new frontier. So I think we'll found our new peaceful tax-free societies on the ocean before we go to Mars.
Yeah, the question of history is between self-sacrifice or sacrifice of another.
Yeah.
So skin in the game is always going to be required to have peace, order, and prosperity. The question is, are you willing to put your skin in the game, or are you going to sacrifice somebody else's skin to make things happen? And that's the difference. And you're right, we did move away from sacrifice in the church. That's what I was talking about earlier. Eat my body, drink my blood. At the roots of humans' culture is evidence of ritual cannibalism, even alongside that sacrifice. And so the question is, we have to found a new civilization where we don't cannibalize each other. Both, in the old way, physically we would do that, but now we do it spiritually. We do it, we do it economically. We cannibalize each other. We devour. We have to one up. We have to exert coercion and exploit power differences. We have to, always, put might makes right. That's cannibalism at its heart. Existentially, that's cannibalism. And so we're moving away from that now. And you really have been tasked with a very historical moment here.
Yeah.
To found a civilization with self-sacrifice of all those entrepreneurs that are going to go with you and build that, civilization and put their skin in the game and give of themselves rather than to, demand someone give something to them.
Right, and this is the very stepwise means by which you build character. And what's so pernicious about the state is that it hijacks my belief in my own virtue. So if I think you should give to the poor people, I don't have to put skin in the game. I don't have to write a check. I don't have to figure out how much I can afford. I can just announce on Facebook that the government should do it. And so the fundamental to humans, you mentioned all these old virtues, charity, and support for other people. If that's in a small community and it's up to you to donate, make sure there's no homeless people in your small community, then you're holding those people responsible, and those people have skin in the game because they have shame about accepting your charity. So yeah, maybe if your husband dies and you're a widow and you have children, we've been all pitching in a pot and we're going to support you for this period of time, but we're also holding you accountable to eventually get on your own feet or whatever. And I think these kind of voluntary relationships is how people feel better about themselves and feel proud of themselves and take on responsibility, instead of the orgy of resentment we see now, where we're just imagining this kind of secular creationism of the state that's going to impose all our virtues on other people through its coercion. And then we don't have to take personal responsibility. And I think on a floating island, on seasteads, it's like, no, you're going to have to build the society. You're going to have to do it through your voluntary relationships. There is no guy with a gun that's going to lock Irwin Schiff to his bed for the rest of his life, because there's not going to be a society based on confiscation and force. And rather than arguing about how we can change this, we can sort of demonstrate how this can work better at no threat to the existing societies, except setting better examples.
So what's the story you want your life to be a part of? That's the story. Do you have a story that you tell?
I want my life to be about unleashing the innovations in people with new values who have thought of better ways of we could instantiate governance and govern ourselves. And these ideas are out there. I was reading about futarchy the other day, and another one I love is liquid democracy. So people come up with ideas, and then we imagine whether it could work theoretically. It'd be much better to give these people a platform where they could try their ideas. You could show up and do it, and you can leave if you don't like it, because you could hopefully detach your island and float away. And this would be a kind of primal soup of societies where we would unleash this sort of variation by societies and selection by residents. And I think in principle, we'd unleash evolution in governance itself. And we could have societies that correspond to the diversity of our values.
Well, very good. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I've enjoyed this discussion very much.
And thanks for illuminating my thinking on much of what you said. This has been very enjoyable. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming.